The arbitration chamber on Station 73 smelled of recycled air and ozone. Theron Voss had learned to read a room through its scent, and this one tasted of old frustration. The Merath delegation occupied the left crescent of the circular table. They were aquatic beings with silver scales that caught the light. Their containment suits hummed with the soft gurgle of circulated water. The suits kept their bodies moist and allowed them to breathe outside their native oceans. Their lead negotiator, a female named Shales That Glint, pulsed bioluminescent patterns across her throat sacs. The light pulses revealed her growing impatience. Across from them, the Thornwall representatives sat in absolute stillness. They were a plantoid species, their hides covered in bark. Defensive thorns bristled from their arms and shoulders. These had relaxed only slightly since the session began. Their speaker, a gnarled elder named Root of Grief, had not moved a single branch in the last. That was a bad sign. Theron folded his hands on the polished stone table and let the silence stretch. 3 decades as a senior broker for the Sol Concordance had taught him that silence was often louder than argument. The human-led political body prized its neutral arbiters, and Theron was one of its best. The mineral rights to the rift shallows were not worth a war. This contested region of deep space was known for its valuable crystalline deposits and unique hydrothermal vents. But its strategic value was what brought 2 species to the brink. To the Thornwall, those crystalline deposits were essential for their spore maturation cycles. The complex biological process required specific mineral frequencies to nurture their young. Without access, their next generation would wither. For the Merath, the same underwater vents were sacred spawning grounds. He had a solution. He always did. A phased extraction schedule could work. This plan would allow the Thornwall to mine in limited, rotating sectors, giving the natural environment time to recover between harvests. The Merath would never agree without oversight. Theron's plan included a monitoring corridor. This protected route would allow Merath patrols to pass through the rift shallows and ensure the Thornwall adhered to the extraction schedule. It was a compromise that offered security to one and resources to the other. If he could make them see it, he could wrap this up in 6 standard hours. He opened his mouth to speak. The door behind him hissed open. Theron turned. A station courier stood in the doorway, her uniform crisp, her expression professionally blank. She held a single data slate, its screen dark. The protocol for couriers was simple. They never interrupted an active arbitration, not for anything short of a system breach. She stepped forward and placed the slate on the table before him. The words on the screen were written in galactic standard, but the header was a deep, bruised purple that seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it. That color was not standard. That color was reserved for priority dark communiques, the kind that bypassed all routing hierarchies and arrived directly from the black space relays used by only one species. Theron's chest tightened. He picked up the slate. The screen flickered and a single symbol resolved itself, the mark of the Darkweave Merchant League. 3 interlocking rings, each one slightly offset from the others, suggesting depths that could not be fully perceived. The Merath negotiator shifted in her suit. Shales That Glint's bioluminescence flared once, a brief pulse of curiosity. She had seen the symbol too. Theron did not explain. He stood, inclined his head to both delegations with practiced courtesy, and said, his voice calm but firm, "I must ask for a brief recess. A private matter." Root of Grief rustled. The Thornwall elder's leaves quivered. "Recess granted," he said, his voice like dry wood rubbing together. "But we will not wait long." Theron nodded and walked out. The corridor outside the chamber was empty. He leaned against the wall and opened the full message. It was encrypted, but his credentials unlocked it immediately. The Darkweave were thorough. They had prepared for him. The text was brief, formal, and chilling. Broker Theron Voss of Sol Concordance. The Merchant League requests your services as neutral arbiter in a proposed acquisition. The Darkweave were a league of void traders who lived in the spaces between stars, conducting business through layers of proxies and encrypted messages. This message came directly from them. The terms were specific. They wished to purchase exclusive, long-term mining rights to a quiet region of space called the Helios Spiral. The spiral was a resource-dense area, rich in rare minerals and stable stellar bodies with no major power claiming it. It was neutral ground, essentially empty. The fee for his brokerage was outrageous. 1,000 standard void crystals delivered upon signing of preliminary terms. A void crystal was a rare, dark jewel that pulsed with trapped light, worth more than most ships. This payment could fund the Sol Concordance's diplomatic operations for a decade. Theron read the numbers twice. His hand trembled slightly. 1,000 void crystals was not a fee, it was a fortune. It was enough to fund the Sol Concordance's diplomatic operations for a decade. It was enough to buy a small fleet. It was enough to make a man like him, a man who had never sought wealth, wealthy beyond any reasonable need. But the Helios Spiral was not politically active. It was a quiet, resource-dense region of space, rich in rare minerals and stable stellar bodies. No major power had claimed it because no major power needed it. It was neutral ground. It was empty. The Darkweave wanted to buy emptiness. That was the part that made his stomach cold. He read the subtext. It was not written in words but in what was missing. There was no timeline. There was no list of contingencies. There was no offer to negotiate the terms. This was not a request. This was a test. The Darkweave were offering him a deal that was too good to refuse, and in doing so they were asking him to step into waters he could not see the bottom of. He thought of the Merath and the Thornwall squabbling over vents and crystals, small conflicts, manageable. He could resolve them with a few careful compromises and a handshake. That was his world. That was the world he had built. This was something else. This was a current pulling him away from the shore. Theron activated his personal comm. The line connected to his office on Earth to his assistant, a young woman named Delia who had learned to read his moods from the cadence of his breathing. "Sir," she said. Her voice was crisp, but there was a question in it. "I am accepting a new assignment," he said, keeping his voice steady, betraying nothing. "Cancel my schedule for the next 3 months. Reassign the Merath Thornwall arbitration to senior broker Ashford. Tell him my notes are in the usual place." There was a pause. 3 months, sir." Delia asked, her voice rising slightly. "Possibly longer," he said. Another pause. Then Delia said, "I will update your calendar." She did not ask for details. That was why he trusted her. He ended the call and stared at the slate. The bruised purple header seemed to pulse, waiting for his response. He tapped the acceptance field. The screen flashed once, then went dark. The message was sent. The deal was begun. Theron Voss, a man who had spent 30 years standing between angry delegations and keeping the peace, had just agreed to broker a transaction that could shift the balance of power in an entire spiral arm. He did not know what the Darkweave wanted with the Helios spiral. He did not know why they had chosen him, but he knew one thing with absolute certainty. This was not about mining rights. He walked back into the arbitration chamber. The Merath and Thornwall delegations looked up. Shales that glint's bioluminescence flickered with impatience. Root of Grief's leaves had curled inward, a sign of displeasure. Theron sat down. He looked at them, these two small factions with their small grievances, and felt a strange, hollow sympathy. They did not know what was coming. Neither did he, not really. But he felt it, a deep pressure in his chest, like the weight of deep water pressing against a hull. He turned to face both delegations and spoke, his tone flat and final. "I have been called away on a matter of some urgency. My colleague, senior broker Ashford, will continue this arbitration. He is capable. I trust you will give him the same courtesy you have given me." Shales that glint's throat sacs flared. She demanded, her bioluminescence pulsing bright with indignation. "You are leaving in the middle of negotiations." "I am," he said simply. Root of Grief made a sound like snapping twigs. The elder said, his leaves rustling with disapproval. "This is irregular, broker Voss." "It is," Theron acknowledged with a slight nod. "But the galaxy is an irregular place." He left them there, two delegations staring after him, their small conflict suddenly insignificant in the shadow of something larger. He walked down the corridor, past the courier, past the observation windows that looked out onto the cold, star-scattered dark. He thought of the Darkweave, those void traders who lived in the spaces between stars, who were never seen in the light of a sun, who conducted their business through layers of proxies and encrypted messages. They were transactional. They were patient. They were not impulsive. They wanted the Helios spiral. They wanted it badly enough to pay a fortune for a broker. Why? The question gnawed at him as he stepped into the transit tube that would take him to the docking ring. The station hummed around him, the familiar sounds of human and alien machinery, the hiss of atmosphere processors, the distant clang of cargo being loaded. He felt like a small craft, a single ship, drifting away from a safe harbor into an ocean he could not measure. The currents were pulling him, and he did not know where they led. But he was a broker. He had spent his life navigating difficult waters. He would find out. The chamber smelled of ozone and slow-moving water. Syndic Zal hung suspended in the center of a fluid sphere. Its membranous body pulsed with a low, rhythmic glow, a being of gelatinous thought and silent calculation. That glow matched the thrum of the prophet's echo. The Syndic's personal vessel was not merely a ship, but an extension of its will, a mobile chamber for the Darkweave Merchant League's quiet business. The barge existed in a state of partial displacement. This technology allowed the vessel to exist slightly out of phase with the rest of the universe, a ghost ship that could not be easily seen or touched. Its bulk was shifted 3 degrees off true reality. The ship brushed against the fabric of normal space like a hand trailing through shallow water, untouchable yet able to observe everything. Zal had no eyes in the human sense. Instead, it perceived the world through subtle pressure differentials. It also sensed faint vibrations that bled across the dimensional gap. The gap was a thin separation between realities, where the barge's displaced hull touched normal space. The human, Theron Voss, sat in his private quarters aboard Station 73, and Zal felt every microshift in the man's posture through the remote sensor array embedded in the message crystal. The Darkweave Syndic did not smile. Its kind had no mouths, but something akin to satisfaction rippled through its gelatinous form. The humans were so beautifully predictable. 3 centuries in galactic society had given them a thin veneer of sophistication, but beneath it they remained what they had always been, emotional creatures driven by fear, pride, and a touching attachment to abstract concepts like honor and fairness. Zal had studied their history, their literature, their endless wars fought over ideas rather than resources. The human brain was a machine built for loyalty, for storytelling, for believing that the universe operated according to rules that mattered. It was the most exploitable weakness Zal had ever encountered. A tendril of awareness brushed against the barge's central data core. The plan was elegant in its simplicity. The Helios spiral was not valuable for its minerals, though the deposits were real enough. The true prize was the Fataris delegation. The Fataris were luminous beings of pure coherent energy. They had recently petitioned for membership in the Galactic Energy Exchange. The exchange was a network that allowed species to trade energy across star systems, stabilizing local power grids. The Fataris were idealistic, naive, desperate for stability after their home star's destabilization. They would accept a loan. They would trust a neutral arbiter, and the Darkweave would own their debt. Zal extended another sensory filament, tasting the emotional residue of the human broker. Theron Voss was conflicted. His body chemistry showed elevated cortisol, reduced serotonin, the classic profile of a creature wrestling with a decision that violated its internal moral framework. The human wanted to refuse the offer. Zal could read it in the micro-sweat beating on his forehead, in the slight dilation of his pupils when he looked at the void crystal payment. But the sum was too large. The lure was too bright. Humans always believed they could handle dangerous things. It was their defining characteristic. The Syndic's consciousness drifted across the chamber, touching the data streams that reported on the Sporax delegation currently negotiating in a nearby sector. The fungal species had amassed significant credits through their spore farming networks, but they were politically isolated, desperate for allies. The Darkweave would offer them a partnership in the Helios venture, a chance to gain favor with the Fataris. The Sporax would accept, of course. They were always hungry for connections. And when the Fataris defaulted, the Sporax would be caught in the collapse. Zal's form rippled with pleasure. The debt web would spread from the Helios spiral across 3 major trade routes, ensnaring the Fataris, the Sporax, and any minor species foolish enough to invest in the venture. The energy market would destabilize. The Darkweave would be there to stabilize it, of course, for a fee, for a percentage, for control. And humanity, dear trusting humanity, would be the face of the deal, the neutral arbiter. The honest broker. The human's culture of honorable dealing was a quaint weakness. Zal had reviewed the files on human negotiation practices, their elaborate rituals of trust building, their obsession with reputation and precedent. They believed that a promise carried weight, that a signature on a contract was sacred. They projected their own emotional logic onto every species they encountered, assuming that everyone played by the same unspoken rules. The Darkweave had no rules, only transactions. Zal's attention sharpened as the human finally moved. Theron Voss stood from his desk, walked to the viewport, and stared out at the star-streaked void. His hands were trembling. Zal measured the frequency of the tremor, calculated the probability of rejection, and found it negligible. The human would accept. He was already rationalizing, already building the mental framework that would let him sleep at night. They always did. They were masters of self-deception. A communication thread pulsed from the station, carrying the human's response. Zal absorbed it without reading the actual words. The emotional signature was enough, relief mixed with resignation, the sweet taste of a soul making peace with its own corruption. The Syndic allowed itself a moment of genuine contentment. The pieces were moving. The board was set. The Darkweave Merchant League had spent centuries weaving threads of obligation through the galactic economy, and now those threads were drawing tight around the Fataris, the Sporax, and the humans who would unknowingly deliver them. The humans thought they were entering a partnership. They would learn, eventually, what it meant to deal with creatures who saw morality as a bargaining chip. Zal pulsed a command through the barge's systems. The Prophet's echo shifted its phase alignment, sliding deeper into the dimensional gap where it could observe without being observed. The Syndic settled into a patient vigil, its form cycling through slow colors of anticipation. The game was long. The game was profitable. And the humans, with their honest faces and trembling hands, were the perfect pieces to play. The summit chamber on Lyra was a circle of suspended basalt, each delegate seated upon a slab of stone that floated in the soft violet twilight of the planet's eternal dusk. Theron Voss stood at the center, a human anchor in a sea of alien stillness. The Fataris delegation pulsed with soft amber light. Their bodies were little more than coherent energy wrapped in filigree containment suits. Across from them, the Sporax envoy sat motionless. It was a cluster of pale fungal growths that communicated through the faint release of aerosolized pheromones. The Illith observers clicked their mandibles in rhythms that might have been impatience or simple respiration. They were insectoid and silent. It was impossible to tell. Theron raised his hand, and the chamber fell quiet. The Darkweave Merchant League proposes a joint extraction agreement for the Helios spiral, he said, his voice carrying the practiced neutrality of a man who had said the same words 100 times in rehearsal. The terms are as follows: 20% of net yield to the Fataris for use of their relay networks, 30% to the Sporax for biological remediation of the extraction sites, and 45% to the Darkweave for capital and dimensional transit costs. He paused. The remaining 5% sat unallocated, a deliberate gap that everyone in the room understood was his commission. Standard practice, nothing unusual. The lead Fataris, a being named Flaren Stillness, pulsed a slow sequence of gold. "And the remaining 5?" they asked, their voice a harmonic hum that seemed to come from everywhere at once. "Administrative overhead," Theron said flatly. "Standard across all concordance-brokered deals." He did not look at the shadow that clung to the far edge of the chamber. Zal was there, of course, a membranous silhouette that seemed to absorb the light around it rather than reflect it. The Darkweave Syndic had not spoken since the summit began. He did not need to. His presence alone was a pressure, a weight that pressed against the back of Theron's neck like a held breath. Theron activated his quantum mind implant. The Tier 5 logic processor hummed to life behind his left temple, a faint vibration that he had long since learned to ignore. It was a tool of his trade, forbidden by some galactic councils but quietly tolerated among independent brokers. It allowed him to model outcomes, to see the branching paths of a negotiation before they unfolded. He fed it the Darkweave contract. The implant parsed the document in less than a second. Subclauses nested inside subclauses, conditional timelines that looped back on themselves. Liability waivers that seemed to apply to no one in particular. The processor flagged 7 items as highly anomalous, motivation unclear. Theron read them again. Each one was a trap, but the shape of the snare eluded him. It was like trying to see the pattern in a fog. Every time he thought he understood a clause, it shifted, its meaning sliding sideways into something else. His human intuition screamed at him. Something was wrong. The implant agreed. But he could not prove it. "The timeline is aggressive," Flaren Stillness said, their amber light dimming to a cautious orange. 40 cycles for full extraction? That would require our relay nodes to operate at sustained peak output. We have not tested that threshold in a century. "The Darkweave will provide supplemental power routing," Theron said, reading from the script Zal had provided, his voice even. "At no additional cost to the Fataris." The Sporax envoy released a cloud of green spores, a gesture that translated roughly to skepticism. Their translator, a small drone that hovered beside them, rendered it as, "We require time to assess the biological impact on our remediation territories. The Helios spiral contains trace elements of collapsed dimension fabric. We cannot guarantee safety without further study." Theron nodded. The contract includes a 60-cycle study period with full funding from the Darkweave. It was a generous offer, too generous. The implant flagged the study period as a delay mechanism, but for what purpose it could not determine. The chamber door slid open. A Thornwall envoy entered, their bark-like forms scraping against the basalt floor. They were not part of the negotiation. They had not been invited. Yet here they were, their root-like limbs dragging a data slate behind them like a funeral shroud. "This summit is a farce," the Thornwall said, their voice a low rustle of leaves. "The Darkweave are not traitors, they are poachers." Theron's stomach dropped. He had seen this before, a public accusation timed for maximum disruption. The question was whether it was true or merely a tactic. "The Thornwall have no stake in this agreement," Theron said, his voice steady. "I must ask you to observe protocol. Protocol is a shield for thieves." The Thornwall envoy raised the data slate, and a hologram flickered to life above it. The image showed a region of space near Thornwall territory, a place where the void itself seemed to ripple and tear. These are dimensional scars, caused by Darkweave smuggling operations. They are tearing holes in the fabric of reality, and they are doing it within our sovereign space. The chamber erupted. The Fataris flared bright white with alarm. The Sporax released a cloud of red spores, the scent of panic. The Illith observers stopped clicking, their mandibles froze in mid-motion. Zal moved. The Darkweave Syndic stepped forward, his shadow form elongating across the floor. When he spoke, his voice was not a sound but a pressure, a vibration that resonated in the bones of every being in the room. "The Thornwall are mistaken," Zal said, his tone as cold and precise as a surgical blade. "The dimensional anomalies they have observed are the result of natural decay in the void. The Darkweave have no interest in damaging the fabric of space. It is, after all, the medium of our trade." The logic was perfect, clean, irrefutable. But Theron had seen the scars. They were not natural. They were too regular, too geometric, like the bite marks of a machine. The accusation was tabled. Protocol demanded it. Without proof, the Thornwall could not derail the summit. The Fataris, however, had gone silent, their amber light flickering with uncertainty. "We will withdraw to deliberate," Flare and Stillness said, their voice a distant hum. Their containment suit hummed as they rose from their floating slab. "This summit is recessed until the next cycle." The chamber emptied. The Fataris drifted out like dying stars. The Sporax followed, their spores trailing behind them. The Illith clicked once, twice, and then they too were gone. Only Theron and Zal remained. The silence stretched. Theron could feel the weight of the Darkweave's attention, a pressure that pressed against his skin like deep water. "You handled that well," Zal said, his form rippling slightly. A small object materialized in the air before Theron. A void crystal, worth more than Theron had earned in his entire career. A gesture of appreciation to ensure continued human facilitation. It was a bribe, naked, obvious, and insulting in its simplicity. Theron looked at the crystal. It pulsed with a light that seemed to come from nowhere, a darkness that was somehow brighter than the chamber around it. He thought of the scars, the anomalous clauses. The way Zal's logic had been too clean, too perfect. "I cannot accept this," Theron said firmly. "Concordance ethics prohibit side payments outside the terms of the contract." Zal's form rippled, not with anger, not with disappointment. It was something else entirely. The confusion of a machine encountering an instruction it could not process. The stillness of a predator that had never seen its prey refuse to run. "You misunderstand," Zal said, the pressure in his voice increasing. "This is not a payment. It is an investment in you, in your continued cooperation." "I understand perfectly," Theron said, meeting the Syndic's unseen gaze. "The answer is no." The silence that followed was not empty. It was full of something ancient and patient, something that had never been denied. Zal's shadow form contracted, then expanded. A slow, deliberate motion. The void crystal vanished. "Very well," Zal said coldly. "The script has changed." He turned and drifted toward the door, his form dissolving into the violet twilight like smoke into wind. Theron stood alone in the empty chamber. His quantum mind implant hummed, still flagging the anomalous clauses, still unable to solve the puzzle. But his human intuition had found its shape. The trap was not in the contract. The trap was in the acceptance. Zal had not needed him to take the bribe. He had needed him to consider it. And now, by refusing, Theron had broken something he did not yet understand. He had just become the variable that the Darkweave could not predict. The chamber aboard Prophet's Echo * hummed with a low, resonant thrum, the sound of dimensional stabilizers holding the barge's partial displacement steady. Syndic Zal floated in the center of the room, his membranous body pulsing with slow, deliberate rhythms. The chemical report from the human Voss was clear. Refusal. The human had rejected the Helios spiral contract. Zal extended a tendril of thought into the weave, the private dimensional channel that connected him to the League's central mind. The connection was immediate, a silent communion of shared data and intent. He sent the full record of Voss's behavior, the elevated cortisol, the tremors, the final, stubborn decline. He sent the human's rationale, parsed from intercepted subvocalizations. Voss had called the deal a trap. He had spoken of honor. The central mind considered this for a span of 3 heartbeats. Its response was not a thought, but a consensus, a rippling wave of agreement that passed through the collective. The human broker was no longer a useful tool. He was an unpredictable variable. Their culture, this stubborn adherence to non-transactional ethics, threatened the larger design. A decision crystallized, a failsafe was enacted. Zal felt the instruction flow back down the dimensional channel, a precise sequence of actions coded in spatial coordinates and data signatures. The League's dimensional engineers, silent specialists who dwelt in the folds between realities, began their work. They did not create a lie from nothing. They harvested fragments of truth, the trajectory of a human patrol drone, the maintenance logs of a human transport, the voice print of a human operative, and wove them into a new pattern. They fabricated evidence that a human Black Ops team, operating under Sol Concordance authority, had assassinated the Fataris delegate. The evidence was flawless. It carried the scent of official encryption protocols. It contained the correct time stamps, the precise energy signatures of human kinetic weapons. It was delivered anonymously through multiple dead drops to every major council within the hour. The galactic reaction was not a storm, it was a vacuum, silence first, then the cascade. The Merath Council issued a statement of condemnation. The Sporaks recalled their diplomatic corps. The Illith, who understood only threat and response, mobilized their defense fleets. The Fataris, their naive energy forms flickering with grief and rage, demanded immediate sanctions. The Thornwall, whose accusation at the summit had been the first crack, now drove the wedge deeper. They produced their own evidence of human duplicity, gathered from their deep-rooted observation networks. The Sol Concordance was declared a rogue state. All treaties were voided, trade embargoes snapped into place like neural closures. Human assets across 1,000 star systems were seized. Human crews were detained. Human embassies were shuttered. Zal observed the feeds from the barge's sensor array. He watched the first human ships being denied port at the Illith trading hub, their hulls gleaming in the light of a yellow star as they drifted, powerless, outside the docking fields. He watched the human ambassadors being escorted from the Merath Council chambers, their faces, those strange, mobile faces, frozen in expressions of shock and disbelief. A clean, surgical severance. The human broker species, now isolated and scapegoated, would collapse into infighting. They would blame each other. They would beg for mercy, for a chance to explain. But the councils would not listen. The evidence was too perfect, the timing too precise. The humans would be removed from the board, their influence dismantled, their reputation destroyed. Zal's body pulsed with a slow, satisfied rhythm. It was a transaction, minimal cost, maximum return. The Helios spiral would be claimed by the League within the cycle. The Fataris would be indebted. The Sporaks would be trapped in the collapse. The Thornwall would be appeased. He extended another tendril of thought into the weave, sending a simple report to the central mind. Transaction complete. The central mind did not reply. It did not need to. The consensus was the reply. Zal floated in the humming chamber, his awareness turned outward to the feeds, watching the human ships drift. They were small things, fragile, built for a gravity and an atmosphere that most of the galaxy found quaint. They had no dimensional drives. They had no shadow casting. They had only their stubborn, foolish culture of trust and honor. And now they had nothing at all. He watched a human freighter attempt to hail the Illith station. The station's response was a single clipped transmission. Deny, deny, deny. The freighter's lights flickered. Its engines dimmed. It began a slow, graceless turn heading back into the black. Zal felt no anger, no triumph, only the quiet satisfaction of a problem solved. The humans had been useful. They had been predictable. They had been a tool that could be shaped and directed, but tools that refuse to function are discarded. Variables that cannot be controlled are eliminated. He turned his attention to the next phase. The Fataris delegate's replacement was arriving in 3 cycles. The loan documents were ready. The interest rates were buried in the fine print, clauses that would compound into eternal debt. The Fataris would sign. They always signed. They trusted in light and good faith. The human had trusted in those things too. Look where it had gotten him. Zal's body settled into a low, stable pulse. The barge hummed around him. The dimensional stabilizers held firm. A transaction concluded, a board cleared. And the Darkweave Merchant League continued its quiet, patient work, weaving the galaxy into a web of debt and dependency, one contract at a time. The Steadfast was a good ship, built in the orbital yards above Titan, her hull scarred by micrometeorites and the routine indignities of deep space patrol. Theron Voss sat in the cramped comms alcove, his fingers laced together, listening to the silence. It was not a natural silence. It was a howling void where voices should have been. The subspace relay, normally a cascade of chatter, fleet positions, trade updates, civilian broadcasts, had gone dead. No, not dead, strangled. Every channel he tried returned the same flat tone: access denied, routing refused, destination blacklisted. He had seen it happen to other species. He had watched the Merath lose their trading rights, their ships turned away from every port. He had never imagined he would feel the cold grip of that same isolation closing around his own throat. The Steadfast's asterisk captain, a weathered woman named Arian Durand, stood at the center of the bridge. Her hands were planted on the navigation console, her knuckles white. "Anything?" she asked, not looking up. "Nothing," said her comms officer, a young man with the fresh, eager face of someone who had never known defeat. His name was Elias. He kept flipping through frequencies as if persistence alone could crack the wall that had risen around them. "No response from Port Clark, no response from the Jovian relay. I'm getting static from the Martian colonies, but it's just emergency loops, automated. Stand by, stand by." Theron felt a cold knot tighten in his chest. He had been a broker for 30 years. He had watched civilizations maneuver, betray, and bargain. He had never seen a species erased from the conversation so completely, so fast. A new tone cut through the silence. A priority broadcast, flagged with the seal of the Sol Concordance High Council. Captain Durand straightened. "Put it on main." The screen flickered to life. A woman sat behind a polished desk, her face pale, her eyes red-rimmed. She wore the formal robes of the Concordance speaker. Behind her, Theron could see the curved windows of the council chamber on Luna. They were dark, empty. "Citizens of the Sol Concordance," she said, her voice trembling. "This is Speaker Alana Pierce. I am speaking to you from an emergency session of the Council. Effective immediately, the Sol Concordance officially acknowledges responsibility for the assassination of the Fataris, delegate to the Helios Spiral Summit. We have received the evidence presented by the Darkweave Merchant League. We have verified its authenticity." Theron's stomach turned to lead. He knew the evidence was a lie. He had been there. He had seen the pieces fall into place. But hearing it spoken aloud, broadcast to every human ship and colony, made it real in a way that shattered something inside him. "All Concordance military vessels are ordered to stand down," the speaker continued, her voice cracking. "All civilian craft are to return to designated ports and await further instruction. All diplomatic personnel are to surrender themselves to the nearest neutral authority for processing. We will comply with all demands of the galactic community. We will accept whatever judgment is rendered." She paused. For a moment her composure broke. Her face crumpled and she looked away from the camera. When she turned back, there were tears on her cheeks. "Do not resist," she whispered. "Please, do not make this worse than it already is." The broadcast ended. The screen went dark. Silence heavy, suffocating. Elias let out a sound that was half laugh, half sob. "She's surrendering, the whole government. She's telling us to just roll over." Captain Durand said nothing. She stared at the dead screen, her face unreadable. Theron felt the despair creep in like a cold tide. He had seen this before, too. He had seen civilizations fold when their leadership collapsed. He had seen the Illith Hive Queens executed and the worker drones wander aimlessly until they starved. He had seen the Thornwall root singers silenced and the great forests of their homeworld wither into silence. Was this it? Was this how humanity ended? Not with a bang, not with a glorious last stand, but with a tired woman on a screen telling them all to lie down and die. Then something beeped. It was a low, insistent sound coming from Elias' console. He looked down, frowning. That's an encrypted signal, subspace, tight beam. It's not from any concordance channel." "Source?" Durand asked, her voice sharp. Elias' fingers flew across the controls. "It's bouncing through multiple relays, masking its origin, but I'm tracing it back. That's odd." "What is?" "It's coming from the Martian Shipwrights Guild, the main forge complex in the Tharsis region." Theron leaned forward. The Martian Shipwrights Guild was a civilian organization that built starship hulls. They had no military authority. They didn't broadcast encrypted signals. A second beep, then a third. "Another signal," Elias said, his voice rising with confusion. "From the Titan Deep Miners Collective, and another from Galileo Station." The Titan Deep Miners Collective was a union of resource extraction crews, while Galileo Station was an academic enclave. They're all sending the same data packet. "Put it on screen," Durand ordered. The main display split into 3 windows. Each showed a stream of text scrolling too fast to read. but Theron caught fragments, old words, ancient names. Remember the Alamo. Remember Sterling. Remember the Long March. Elia's breath caught. There's more. Audio files, historical recordings. I'm getting a song. It sounds like a military march, really old. The audio crackled to life. A chorus of male voices, rough and raw, singing words Theron barely recognized. It was a language older than the concordance, older than the colonies. Old Earth English. From the halls of Montezuma to the shores of Tripoli. Theron felt a shiver run down his spine. He knew that song. His grandfather had sung it to him when he was a child, told him stories about the old Marine Corps, about a time when humanity fought with bullets and bayonets instead of railguns and quantum mines. "What is this?" Durand whispered. Theron opened his mouth to answer, but the truth was already forming in his mind, cold and clear and terrifying. This was not a military command. This was something older, something deeper. The cultural memes had been activated. He had studied history. He had read about the fall of old Earth governments, the way that decentralized cells had kept fighting long after the official capitulation. The Alamo, Sterling, the Long March, they were not just battles, they were symbols, touchstones, triggers. Someone had prepared for this. Someone had built a dead man's switch into the human collective unconscious. "We need to get off the grid," Theron said, his voice low. Durand turned to look at him. "What are you talking about?" "Those signals, they're not orders, they're instructions. A protocol, we need to go dark. Disconnect from the concordance network, cut all ties." "Go dark, we're already cut off from everything. The ports are closed, the relays are blocked." "No," Theron said, stepping toward her. "We need to cut ourselves off. Voluntarily, we need to become a ghost. No transponder, no beacon, no identification, we vanish." Durand stared at him. "That's desertion, that's mutiny. That's survival." Another signal came through. This one was text, simple and direct. It scrolled across the bottom of the main screen. "Sterling Protocol activated. All concordance affiliation voided. You are now independent operatives. Your objective, survive, harass, persist. Do not recognize the surrender. Do not surrender yourselves. The Council may have fallen. Humanity has not." Elias read it aloud, his voice shaking. When he finished, the bridge was silent again. But it was a different kind of silence. Not despair, something else, something sharp and bright and dangerous. Captain Durand looked at Theron. Her eyes were hard, calculating. "You think this is real?" "I think," Theron said slowly, "that someone planned for this moment, years ago, decades. They built a network of people who would know what to do when the government fell. They seeded the culture with stories and songs and symbols that would wake us up when the time came. And the time is now." "Yes." Durand turned to her navigation officer. "Plot a course. Silent running, no emissions, take us into the rift shallows. We can hide in the debris fields." The officer nodded, his hands moving across the controls. And Durand added, her voice dropping to a whisper, "Erase our registry. Wipe the Steadfast from every database we can reach. As far as the galaxy is concerned, this ship never existed." Theron watched as the crew moved with a sudden, focused energy. The despair was gone. In its place was something else, purpose. He looked at the screen where the fragments of old battle hymns still scrolled. He thought of the Martian shipwrights, the Titan miners, the scholars of Galileo Station. They were not soldiers. They were not leaders. They were just people. And they had just done something extraordinary. They had refused to die. The Steadfast powered down her transponder. Her engines shifted to a low-emission configuration. The lights dimmed, and the hum of the reactors dropped to a whisper. They were no longer a concordance vessel. They were a ghost. And ghosts, Theron knew, were very hard to kill. The dimensional anchor point designated Nexus 7 Thorn had been a silent sentinel for 40 cycles. It was a structure that stabilized spacetime for safe travel. The anchor hung in the subbrain like a pearl on a string. The subbrain was a layer of reality used for faster-than-light transit. From there, it routed trade traffic through safe corridors between Darkweave holdings and the Thornwall borderlands. No living being tended it. No ship passed within 1,000 kilometers. It was, by any measure, the most secure node in the eastern quadrant. It went dark at 1934 station time. Syndic Zal perceived the loss as a sudden absence in the League's sensory web, a gap where pressure should have been. The central mind pulsed with confusion. A dimensional anchor could not simply fail. It had no moving parts. It drew power from the vacuum itself. It was, for all practical purposes, eternal. A recovery drone reached the coordinates 7 hours later. Zal accessed its visual feed and processed the image with something approaching disbelief. The anchor's core housing had been breached, not by a precision weapon or a sophisticated countermeasure, but by a crude plasma charge welded directly to the outer casing. The explosive had been shaped to direct its force inward, punching through layered armor that could withstand a capital ship's broadside. The drone's sensors detected trace organic residue, human, specifically human sweat and skin cells pressed into the metal where the saboteur had worked. Zal studied the damage patterns. The charge had been placed with intimate knowledge of the anchor's internal geometry. The saboteur had known exactly where to cut, exactly how deep to drill, exactly how much force would sever the connection without triggering a containment failure. This was not guesswork. This was expertise purchased with months of study. The central mind convened. Analysis flowed between the syndics like dark water. The conclusion was unanimous. This attack required premeditation, resources, and a willingness to die. The human who did this had known they would likely not escape. Zal found this troubling in a way it could not articulate. 72 hours later, the luxury goods convoy Glory of the Fourth Veil vanished in transit. The route was human-adjacent space, a corridor that skirted the edge of the Sol system's exclusion zone. The convoy carried silks from the Fataris vestments, crystallized spices from the Merath deep reefs, and art objects from a dozen minor species. Its value was astronomical. No debris field was found. No ransom demand arrived. The ship simply ceased to exist. Zal reviewed the flight logs. The convoy had signaled a routine position check, then gone silent. The time between the last transmission and the expected arrival at the next relay was 17 minutes. In 17 minutes, 4 ships had been erased without a trace. The central mind offered probabilities. Piracy was unlikely. The Darkweave did not tolerate piracy, and the local systems knew this. Military action was equally improbable. No fleet had been detected. No energy signatures had been recorded. Zal's cognitive processes generated a conclusion it did not wish to accept. The ships had been boarded. The cargo had been confiscated. The crews had been taken. And whoever had done this knew exactly how to hide their work. The third event was smaller. It was almost invisible against the scale of the first 2. A data packet arrived for Syndic Zal, routed through 17 anonymizing relays. It bore no encryption, no signature, no demands. It was simply a list. Zal opened it. The list contained names, human names, brokers, diplomats, traders, aides. Each name was followed by a location and a status. Some entries read * deceased or in custody *. Next to those entries was a single word, account settled. Next to others, a different word appeared, account pending. The list went on for 347 entries. Zal scrolled. It recognized some of the names from the embargo's aftermath. The Sol Concordance had surrendered. Its people had been arrested, tried, imprisoned, or executed depending on the local species' customs. The Darkweave had considered this a satisfactory conclusion. The humans were defeated. The problem was solved. The final entry stopped Zal's processing cold. Name Voss Theron, status active, location unknown, account open. The central mind rippled with alarm. Theron Voss was supposed to be dead. The League's records showed his ship, the Steadfast Asterisk, had been denied port at every station in the sector. It had no fuel, no supplies, no allies. It should have drifted into the void weeks ago, its crew frozen or suffocated. But the list claimed otherwise, and the list had been accurate for every other name. Zal initiated a deep search. It pulled every scrap of data on Theron Voss, his associates, his history. The human was a broker, a neutral, a man who solved problems with words. He was not a soldier. He was not a commander. He was, by every metric, insignificant. And yet someone had taken the time to build this list. Someone had tracked every human who had been wronged by the embargo. Someone was keeping score. The central mind attempted to model the threat. It assumed a human resistance organization, perhaps a remnant of the Sol Concordance military. It assumed a command structure, a chain of authority, a strategic objective. The model failed. The attacks did not follow strategic logic. They did not target supply lines or production facilities or military assets. They targeted individuals. They targeted the people who had signed the documents, processed the claims, ordered the arrests. They were not designed to win a war. They were designed to settle a debt. Zal accessed the recovered drone footage again. It watched the plasma charge detonate, watched the dimensional anchor tear itself apart. The saboteur had died in that blast. There was no escape pod, no last-second jump. The human had simply done the work and accepted the consequence. This was not warfare. This was something older, something the Darkweave had not accounted for in their calculations. The central mind reached a consensus. They were not fighting a state. They were not fighting a military. They were fighting a culture that had been told it was dead and had refused to believe it. Zal felt a sensation it had never experienced in its long existence. It was not fear, not exactly. Fear was a response to immediate danger. This was something deeper, a slow dread that coiled in the spaces between its thoughts. It thought of the human ships denied port, drifting in the dark. It thought of the families separated, the lives destroyed, the names on that list. It had assumed those people were finished. It had assumed they would scatter, fade, die quietly. But the list said otherwise. The list said they were still here. Zal opened a channel to the central mind. It requested a full security review of every League asset within 10 sectors. It requested a threat assessment of human remnant cells. It requested an update on the location of Theron Voss. The responses came back empty. There was no central command to track. There was no fleet to monitor. There were only ghosts moving through the dark, checking names off a list. For the first time in its existence, Syndic Zal understood what it meant to be hunted. It closed the data packet and sat in silence. The list remained on its display, each name a small, patient accusation. 347 entries, 347 reasons why the Darkweave had not ended this war. They had only started it. The Steadfast drifted through the black between stars, her hull a patchwork of civilian plating and jury-rigged military salvage. Around her, 47 other ships held formation in the dark. Mining haulers with point defense cannons bolted to their decks, cargo freighters carrying torpedoes in their holds, and one old solar yacht whose owner had donated it as a scout because it was, in his words, the fastest thing left that still flies for the human flag. Theron Voss stood on the bridge, watching the tactical display. The flotilla had no name, no official designation, no chain of command that any galactic council would recognize. They were simply the ships that had answered the signal from Tharsis. The ships whose captains had looked at the surrender, looked at the evidence that every human knew was a lie, and decided that some debts were too old to be canceled by a politician's signature. Elias sat at the communications station, his fingers dancing across a console that had been patched together from 3 different models. "We've got the window," he said, not looking up. "The Asterisk Prophet's Echo will enter dimensional phase alignment in approximately 6 minutes. They'll be locked into a fixed spatial coordinate for exactly 14 seconds. 14 seconds, Captain Durand repeated from the command chair. Her voice carried the flat calm of someone who had already accepted that they might not survive the next hour. "That's not much time to split a universe open." "We don't need to split it," Theron said. "Just fold it." He looked at the schematics displayed on his personal screen. The Darkweave had given him access to their dimensional architecture during the negotiation, trusting that a mere human broker could never understand the mathematics, let alone weaponize them. They had underestimated what desperation could teach a species that had been staring at the stars for 10,000 years, wondering if anyone was out there, and had never stopped wondering even after they finally found company. The reality fracture device had been built in a Martian forge complex that had once manufactured agricultural equipment. Its core was a stolen Darkweave dimensional anchor, reverse-engineered by engineers who had never seen the full schematic, but had guessed the missing pieces through sheer stubborn mathematics. The containment field was a repurposed warp drive, its safety limiters removed, and its output dialed to a setting that every manual described as catastrophic failure. They had built a bomb that could tear a hole in the fabric of existence. They had built it in 6 days. "Theron," Durand's voice pulled him back. "You don't have to be the one to go aboard." "I do," he said. "They know me. Zal knows me. If I walk onto that barge, they'll understand what's happening before I say a word. That's the point." She held his gaze for a long moment, then nodded once. 4 minutes. Theron moved to the airlock where a suit waited, standard human pressure gear, nothing that would impress any alien observer. He climbed into it with practiced efficiency, checking the seals, testing the helmet's comms. In his hand, he carried a data cylinder. It contained nothing but logs, records that the Darkweave had believed were safely encrypted, safely hidden, safely forgotten. Records that human intelligence operatives had spent the last 3 months recovering, one fragment at a time, from dimensional buffers that were never meant to be accessed by minds that thought in 3 dimensions. 1 minute, Elias said over the comms. Theron, the phase window is precise. If you're not off that barge within 12 seconds of the fracture collapsing, you'll be trapped with them. I know. You'll die in there, or worse. Nobody knows what happens to a human body in a folded pocket of space-time. I know. The airlock cycled. Theron stepped into the void. The asterisk prophet's echo hung before him, a mass of membranous darkness that seemed to drink the starlight. It was beautiful in the way that deep water was beautiful, calm on the surface, impossible to see through, and full of things that had evolved to kill anything that fell in. Theron's suit thrusters fired, pushing him across the gap. He landed on the barge's outer hull, his magnetic boots clamping onto a surface that felt more like living tissue than metal. He found the emergency access port exactly where the schematics had said it would be. The Darkweave had never considered the possibility that a human might use their maintenance protocols against them. The port opened. Theron climbed inside. The interior of the asterisk prophet's echo was a labyrinth of corridors that twisted in ways that made his inner ear protest. The air smelled of ozone and something else, something that his brain refused to categorize. He followed the dimensional signature that his helmet's sensors had been calibrated to detect, the central chamber, where Syndic Zal would be writing out the phase alignment. He found the chamber door open. He walked through. Zal was there, suspended in the center of the room, their membranous form flickering with unstable energy as the dimensional alignment reached its peak. They had no eyes to see him, no mouth to speak, but they sensed him nonetheless. Their body rippled, contracting in what Theron had learned to recognize as surprise. Syndic Zal, Theron said, his voice echoed in the chamber, flat and final. I have come to settle an account. The energy around Zal pulsed, their form shifting through colors that had no names in any human language. A translator module on the wall crackled to life, rendering their meaning into words. You are dead. The League records confirm your death. The League records are wrong. Theron held up the data cylinder. Just like the records that said Sol Concordance operatives killed the Fatarist delegate, just like the records that said humanity had no choice but to surrender. Your people are very good at making records say what you want them to say. Zal's form contracted further. You cannot be here. This vessel is protected by dimensional wards that no human can penetrate. Your wards were designed to keep out threats you understood. Theron stepped closer. You never understood us. You thought our government was our strength. You thought if you broke our chains of command, we would scatter and die, but you were wrong. He pressed a button on the data cylinder. A holographic display flickered to life, showing the asterisk prophet's echo asterisk as a schematic, surrounded by the 47 ghost ships of the human flotilla. Look at your sensors, Theron said. Look at what we've placed around you. Zal's energy flickered. The phase alignment. You cannot interfere with the phase alignment. We already have. Outside in the black between stars, the jury-rigged reality fracture device activated. It did not explode. It did not destroy. It simply folded, taking a section of space-time and bending it back on itself, sealing the asterisk prophet's echo in a pocket of dimensions that did not connect to the rest of the universe. The chamber lurched. Zal's form destabilized, their energy pulsing erratically as their connection to the dimensional network was severed. They were trapped, truly, completely, irrevocably trapped. What have you done? The translator crackled. Collected a debt, Theron said. He walked to the chamber's central console, the one that controlled the asterisk prophet's echo's asterisk internal data systems. The Darkweave had designed it to be operated only by their kind, but human engineers had spent 3 months studying the design, finding the workarounds, building the interface that would allow a human to speak to a Darkweave machine. Theron plugged the data cylinder into the console. The logs began to upload. Stop, Zal said. We can negotiate, we can. There is nothing to negotiate. Theron turned to face them. You made a mistake. You thought you broke our government, but you only woke up our stories, and our stories tell us to never, ever forget a debt. The upload completed. The logs streamed out through the asterisk prophet's echo's asterisk emergency subspace beacon, broadcasting to every receiver in the galaxy. The Merath councils, the Sporex collectives, the Illith hive minds, the Thornwall root networks, the Fataris energy bodies, and every other species that had accepted the Darkweave's lies as truth. The logs showed everything: the fabrication of evidence, the falsified communication records, the assassins who were never human, the surrender that was never real. "Your people traded in lies," Theron said. "You thought you could buy our destruction with credits and deception, but we are not a species that sells its dead." Zal's form flickered, their energy dimming. "What do you want?" "Nothing." Theron walked toward the chamber's exit. "The account is settled." "You cannot leave. The fold will trap you with us." "The fold was designed by humans." Theron paused at the door. "We built a way out." He stepped through the door. Behind him, Zal's translator crackled one last time, a single word that might have been a question or might have been a curse. Theron did not look back. He moved through the twisting corridors, his suit's navigation system guiding him toward the hull breach that would open exactly when he needed it to. The 47 ghost ships had already begun their retreat, their warp drives spooling up to carry them into the safety of deep space before the dimensional fold stabilized permanently. Theron reached the hull. He stepped into the void. The Steadfast was waiting for him, her airlock open, her engines burning hot. He climbed inside, pulled off his helmet, and stood in the airlock as the pressure equalized. Elia's voice came over the intercom. "You did it. The whole galaxy is seeing the logs. The Merath are already recalling their condemnation. The Fataris are broadcasting statements of support. We just picked up a transmission from a Thornwall war fleet. They're offering to escort any human vessel that needs safe passage." Theron leaned against the airlock wall. He felt old. He felt tired. He felt something that might have been peace or might have been the beginning of grief. "What about the Darkweave?" he asked. "Silent, their central mind is still processing, but they can't deny the evidence." A pause. "Theron, you're a hero." "No," Theron closed his eyes. "I'm just a broker who remembered what his grandmother told him. She said that the universe doesn't care about your intentions. It only cares about what you leave behind." He opened his eyes and looked out the airlock's small window. The asterisk prophet's echo hung in the distance, a dark shape that was slowly fading from visible space, folding into a pocket of reality that would hold it forever. "That's what we left behind," he said. "A story, a debt, a promise that we would never stop until the account was settled." The Steadfast turned away from the fading barge. The 47 ghost ships followed, a ragged flotilla of survivors and stubborn ghosts, carrying with them the oldest weapon in the human arsenal, a memory that refused to die. The galaxy watched, and for the first time in 300 years, they saw humanity not as a competent peer, not as a defeated pariah, but as something far more dangerous. A people whose power was never in their government. It was in their stories. And their stories told them to never, ever forget a debt.